The studio lights burned bright as Kaitlan Collins straightened her notes, her signature composed smirk barely concealing the anticipation underneath. It was another night, another showdown, and tonight, the guest in the hot seat was none other than Karoline Lavit, the young, firebrand conservative commentator who had been making waves with her unfiltered takes and unapologetic stance against mainstream media narratives. Seated across from her, Karoline appeared unbothered, a confident half-smile playing at the edges of her lips. The producers had barely finished counting down before Kaitlan jumped in. Kaitlan Collins. Tonight, we have Karoline Lavit joining us, a figure who has been making headlines for her controversial rhetoric and unwavering support for policies that many argue are extreme. Karoline, welcome to the show. Karoline Lavit. Thanks for having me, Kaitlan. Though I must say, I appreciate the warm welcome. Calling me extreme before I even speak is an interesting approach to journalism. The smirk on Kaitlan's face twitched for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. Kaitlan Collins. Well, let's dive right in. You've been vocal in your criticism of the current administration, calling policies on the economy, immigration, and social justice destructive and delusional. What exactly do you mean by that? Karoline tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the softball nature of the question. Karoline Lavit. What I mean is exactly what the American people are seeing every single day. Inflation is squeezing families dry. Illegal immigration is spiraling out of control, and the media, people like you, continue to push narratives that deflect from reality. Kaitlan let out a rehearsed chuckle, her attempt at brushing aside the remark. Kaitlan Collins. Karoline, surely you realize that's an oversimplification. The economy is recovering, job numbers are up, and... Karoline Lavit. And the American people are paying double for groceries. Small businesses are collapsing, and we're handing out welfare to illegal immigrants while ignoring struggling citizens. But sure, let's keep pretending things are fine. Kaitlan inhaled sharply, her eyes narrowing. Kaitlan Collins. You talk about illegal immigration, yet your party has failed to propose a comprehensive solution. Do you really think inflammatory language and fear-mongering solve the issue? Karoline leaned forward slightly, her tone unwavering. Karoline Lavit. You mean, do I think enforcing the law and securing our borders solve the issue? Yes, Kaitlan, I do. But it's fascinating how you and your network love to paint conservatives as fear-mongers for simply wanting order. Tell me, do you lock your doors at night, or is that inflammatory too? The studio fell silent for a beat. Kaitlan's lips parted, as if she was about to retort, but she hesitated. Karoline sat back, as if challenging her to come up with a coherent response. Kaitlan's earpiece buzzed, likely a producer telling her to steer the conversation elsewhere. She exhaled quickly and flipped a page on her notepad. Kaitlan Collins. Let's talk about election integrity. You repeatedly suggested there were irregularities in past elections, despite numerous court rulings and investigations finding no widespread fraud. Isn't this dangerous rhetoric? Karoline's smile didn't fade. If anything, it grew. Karoline Lavit. Dangerous rhetoric is what you people have been feeding the public for years. Russia hoaxes, impeachment hysteria, labeling half the country as threats to democracy. But the moment we question election transparency, suddenly with extremists, Kaitlan shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The frustration was creeping into her expression, and Karoline knew she had her right where she wanted her. Kaitlan Collins. So you don't trust our democratic institutions? Karoline raised an eyebrow. Karoline Lavit. I trust the Constitution. I don't trust the same media that told us the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, and then quietly admitted it was real 2 years later. I don't trust intelligence agencies that interfere in elections, and I certainly don't trust fact-checkers who only seem interested in silencing one side. Kaitlan opened her mouth to interject, but Karoline wasn't finished. Karoline Lavit. And let's be real, if questioning election results is an attack on democracy, why is it fine when Democrats do it? Hillary Clinton spent years calling 2016 stolen. Stacey Abrams still hasn't conceded her race. Where was your outrage then? Kaitlan's jaw clenched. She was used to controlling these interviews. cutting off guests before they could fully expose the double standards, but Karoline wasn't giving her an inch. Instead of responding directly, Kaitlan flipped the script. Kaitlan Collins, you're painting a picture of bias, but isn't it true that conservative media outlets also spread misinformation? Take, for example, recent reports that some right-wing platforms have pushed false narratives about major events. Karoline let out a sharp laugh. Karoline Lavit, oh, so we're playing the whataboutism game now? That's rich coming from someone who works for a network that spent years peddling the biggest lies in modern history. Want to talk about the Steele dossier, the Charlottesville Fine People hoax, the endless COVID hypocrisy, or do those false narratives not count? Kaitlan's earpiece buzzed again. She was losing ground fast. She glanced at the teleprompter. But the scripted counterpoints weren't enough. Karoline wasn't a typical guest who could be steamrolled with standard talking points. Kaitlan Collins, let's get back to the bigger picture. Many Americans are tired of division. Don't you think your rhetoric only adds fuel to the fire? Karoline's gaze locked onto her. Karoline Lavit, you know what's fueling division, Kaitlan? It's networks like yours telling half the country they're irredeemable bigots for having different views. It's politicians who demand unity while labeling dissenters as threats. It's hypocrisy, plain and simple. And I think Americans are sick of it. Kaitlan exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the pen in her hand. She was running out of ways to spin the conversation, and Karoline knew it. Karoline Lavit, but hey, if you think accountability is divisive, maybe the problem isn't the rhetoric. Maybe the problem is the truth. Silence hung in the air for a moment. The cameras rolled, but Kaitlan had no witty comeback. Her signature composure cracked ever so slightly as she forced a tight-lipped smile. The segment producer signaled for a commercial break. Kaitlan swallowed hard, knowing that for the first time in a long time, she had been outmatched on her own turf. And Karoline? She simply leaned back in her chair, unfazed, victorious, and ready for more. As the cameras rolled back after the commercial break, the tension in the studio was palpable. The air was thick with unspoken frustration, and the control room was buzzing with producers scrambling to shift the narrative. Kaitlan Collins forced a smile as she shuffled her notes. She wasn't used to losing control of interviews, and Karoline Lavit had already dismantled half of her talking points with surgical precision, but she wasn't giving up yet. Kaitlan Collins, welcome back. We're here with Karoline Lavit, who has been outspoken about her conservative viewpoints, often clashing with mainstream narratives. Karoline, before the break, you made some bold claims about election integrity and media bias. But let's address something more personal. Your rhetoric has been labeled as inflammatory. Do you ever consider that your words might contribute to misinformation or even incite division? Karoline didn't miss a beat. Karoline Lavit, you mean like when your network spent years pushing the Russian collusion hoax only for it to be debunked? Or when your hosts called millions of Americans threats to democracy for supporting a different candidate? Help me understand. Do you guys ever stop and consider the division you create? Kaitlan let out a controlled breath. The heat was rising, and Karoline wasn't backing down. Kaitlan Collins, you're dodging the question. Your language is often confrontational, and some argue it emboldens extremists. Do you take any responsibility for that? Karoline raised an eyebrow, her expression a perfect blend of amusement and challenge. Karoline Lavit, you want to talk about emboldening extremists? Your network was at the forefront of justifying riots that burned down businesses and destroyed communities. You called them mostly peaceful protests while buildings were literally on fire behind your reporters. Do you take responsibility for that? Kaitlan's fingers tightened around her pen. She was losing ground. Again, the producer's voice crackled in her earpiece, urging her to regain control. Kaitlan Collins, that's not what we're talking about. Let's stay on topic. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her voice razor-sharp. Karoline Lavit, of course it's not, because accountability is only a one-way street in your world. Let's be honest. This isn't about my rhetoric. It's about the fact that conservatives are finally refusing to be silenced, and that terrifies you. Kaitlan exhaled sharply and flipped to a new page in her notes, signaling a shift in strategy. Kaitlan Collins, let's move on to policy. You've been vocal in your criticism of this administration's approach to climate change. Are you denying that climate change is real? Karoline laughed softly. Karoline Lavit, that's cute, Kaitlan. You know that's not what I've ever said. What I criticize is the radical policies being pushed in the name of climate change. Policies that kill jobs, hike energy prices, and punish middle-class families while letting China pollute unchecked. Kaitlan Collins, but don't you think bold action is necessary? The science is clear. Climate change is accelerating, and experts agree that we need immediate intervention. Karoline tilted her head. Karoline Lavit, you mean like how the science was clear when you all told us shutting down schools and masking toddlers was necessary? Or when you said vaccines would prevent transmission? Forgive me if I don't just blindly accept whatever experts the media cherry picks. Kaitlan's jaw clenched ever so slightly. She wasn't used to being on the defensive. Kaitlan Collins, Karoline, these are serious issues. Surely you don't believe all experts are wrong. Karoline's smile was razor-sharp. Karoline Lavit, no, I just believe that experts who conveniently align with a political agenda shouldn't be treated as infallible gods. The real issue here isn't science. It's power. And the people pushing these policies don't care about the environment. They care about control. Kaitlan's expression hardened. Kaitlan Collins, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. Karoline laughed outright. Karoline Lavit, of course it does. Everything that challenges your narrative magically becomes a conspiracy theory. Until it turns out to be true, then somehow we all just move on like it never happened. Kaitlan's earpiece buzzed again. The producers were getting desperate. She needed to wrap this segment up on a high note, but Karoline wasn't giving her any room to maneuver. She tried one last pivot. Kaitlan Collins, let's talk about women's rights. Many critics argue that conservative policies are rolling back progress for women, particularly regarding reproductive rights. Do you consider yourself an advocate for women? Karoline's expression didn't waver. Karoline Lavit, I do. That's why I stand against a modern feminist movement that tells women they have to sacrifice family, femininity, and even biological reality to be empowered. Kaitlan blinked. Kaitlan Collins, so you don't believe in gender equality? Karoline let out a dry chuckle. Karoline Lavit, I believe men and women are equal in value, but different in nature. And pretending those differences don't exist isn't progress, it's insanity. Kaitlan shook her head. Kaitlan Collins, that's a controversial stance in today's society. Karoline smirked. Karoline Lavit, only because people like you decided that basic biology is offensive. The temperature in the room had shifted. Kaitlan was out of angles. The usual tactics, framing conservatives as extremists, labeling counterarguments as conspiracy theories, deflecting blame, had all fallen flat. Karoline had not only defended her position, but had flipped every single question back onto Kaitlan and her network. And the audience? They could see it. Kaitlan forced another tight-lipped smile and glanced at the camera. Kaitlan Collins, we have to take another break, but when we come back, we'll discuss Karoline's thoughts on the future of conservative politics and her role in shaping it. As soon as the cameras cut, Kaitlan exhaled sharply and shot a look at her producers. The frustration was evident in her expression. Karoline, on the other hand, sat back, completely at ease. She had come into this interview prepared for a battle, and so far, she was winning. The studio buzzed with tension as the countdown for the next segment began. Kaitlan Collins sat stiffly, gripping her pen a little too tightly, while Karoline Lavit exuded effortless confidence, barely hiding her amusement at how easily she had unraveled the mainstream narrative so far. The camera light blinked red. They were live again. Kaitlan straightened in her chair, forcing composed expression as she moved on to her next angle of attack. Kaitlan Collins, welcome back. We're continuing our discussion with Karoline Lavit, a rising conservative voice who has gained attention for her strong opposition to progressive policies. Karoline, before the break, we touched on gender equality. Let's pivot to something even broader. Your views on diversity and inclusion. Many on the right have pushed back against efforts to promote inclusivity, claiming that diversity initiatives are harmful. Why do you think that is? Karoline chuckled softly, shaking her head. Karoline Levitt, Kaitlan, let's be real here. Nobody is against diversity. What conservatives are against is forced diversity, policies that prioritize skin color, gender, or sexual identity over merit and capability. That's not progress. That's discrimination, just rebranded. Kaitlan's lips tightened. Kaitlan Collins, so you don't support affirmative action or workplace diversity programs? Karoline leaned forward slightly. Karoline Levitt, I support hiring the best person for the job, period. And I find it funny how the same people who scream about equality are perfectly fine with lowering standards as long as it fits their political agenda. Kaitlan Collins, so you're saying systemic barriers don't exist? Karoline smirked. Karoline Levitt, no, I'm saying that the biggest barrier most people face is an unwillingness to take responsibility for their own success. Hard work matters. Competence matters. And you know who knows that better than anyone? Immigrants who come to this country legally, work their tails off, and succeed despite every excuse the left tries to shove down their throats. Kaitlan's jaw tightened. She wasn't winning this argument either. Her earpiece crackled. The producers wanted a harder pivot. She shuffled her papers, glancing down at her pre-scripted attack line. Kaitlan Collins, let's talk about something else you've been criticized for, your stance on gun control. After recent mass shootings, many Americans have called for stricter gun laws. Do you really believe more guns are a solution to gun violence? Karoline laughed outright. Karoline Levitt, nice attempt at framing the question. Let me make this simple. Criminals don't follow gun laws. And every time you guys push for more restrictions, the only people who suffer are law-abiding citizens. Kaitlan squared her shoulders, trying to regain control. Kaitlan Collins, but don't statistics show that countries with stricter gun laws have lower gun violence rates? Karoline tilted her head. Karoline Levitt, oh, you mean the statistics that conveniently ignore the fact that cities with the strictest gun laws in the U.S., like Chicago, also have some of the highest gun crime rates? Or the fact that lawful gun owners prevent an estimated 2.5 million crimes per year in this country? Kaitlan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Kaitlan Collins, so you don't believe in any form of gun regulation? Karoline Levitt, of course I do. But I also believe that punishing responsible gun owners for the actions of criminals makes about as much sense as banning cars because of drunk drivers. Kaitlan's frustration was becoming impossible to hide. The usual tactics, misframing, misquoting, and manipulating the argument, weren't working. Karoline wasn't just answering the questions. She was flipping the entire premise against her. Desperate to regain footing, Kaitlan pivoted again. Kaitlan Collins, let's shift to something personal. You've been accused of pushing extremist views that align with far-right ideologies. How do you respond to critics who say you're part of a dangerous movement? Karoline smirked, shaking her head. Karoline Levitt, yes, the classic, label your opponent as extreme so you don't have to debate them tactic. Kaitlan, let's be honest. Your network calls anyone who disagrees with the left far-right. Kaitlan's nostrils flared slightly, but she held her ground. Kaitlan Collins, that's not true. Karoline arched an eyebrow. Karoline Levitt, really? So was Tulsi Gabbard far-right? When she called out the Democratic Party's corruption? Was Joe Rogan far-right? When he questioned the media's COVID narratives? How about Elon Musk? Bill Maher? Are we just going to keep moving the goalpost until everyone is a right-wing extremist except for the people who blindly agree with you? Kaitlan's lips pressed together into a thin line. The studio felt hotter. Her earpiece buzzed again. Wrap it up. Move to the closing question. She adjusted her posture, taking a deep breath before delivering her final attempt to save face. Kaitlan Collins, all right, final question. You clearly have strong opinions and aren't afraid to challenge the mainstream. But do you ever worry that your approach is too aggressive? That you're pushing away moderates instead of building bridges? Karoline's smile was steady, her eyes locked onto Kaitlan's. Karoline Levitt, no, Kaitlan. What I worry about is the fact that Americans have been gaslit into thinking that standing up for common sense is extreme. I worry about how the media manipulates the truth to fit a narrative. And I worry that too many people in this country are too afraid to speak out because they know they'll be labeled, smeared, or silenced by networks like yours. Kaitlan opened her mouth to respond, but Karoline wasn't done. Karoline Lavit. And you know what? I'm not here to build bridges with people who hate this country, want to strip away our rights, and demonize anyone who refuses to bow to their ideology. I'm here to fight for the people who are sick of the lies. And judging by how desperate you've been to spin this conversation, I'd say we're winning. The silence in the studio was deafening. Kaitlan's lips parted, as if she was going to throw out one final line. But nothing came. She had no comeback, no witty closing remark. The control room was in full panic mode. Cut to commercial. Now, the red light on the camera blinked off. Kaitlan exhaled sharply, her fingers gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked at Karoline, who sat there, calm and collected, as if the entire interview had been nothing more than a casual conversation. For the first time in her career, Kaitlan Collins had been brutally outmaneuvered, and she knew it. The studio air was thick with tension as the red camera light flickered off, signaling the end of the segment. Kaitlan Collins remained seated, her grip on her pen tightening as she stared at Karoline Lavit, who looked completely unfazed, almost amused. The silence was deafening. Producers frantically spoke through Kaitlan's earpiece, their voices a chaotic mix of disbelief and frustration. The entire interview had spiraled out of their control. Karoline had not only refused to be boxed in, but had systematically dismantled every single argument thrown her way. Kaitlan exhaled sharply and leaned forward, her voice hushed but edged with irritation. Kaitlan Collins, you think this was a win for you? Karoline smirked, casually adjusting the microphone clip to her blazer. Karoline Lavit, no, Kaitlan, I know it was. A studio assistant rushed over, removing Karoline's mic as another producer whispered something to Kaitlan, who gave a curt nod before standing up. The show's director approached hastily, eyes darting between them. Director, that was quite the segment. Kaitlan shot him a sharp glare. Kaitlan Collins, you think? The director cleared his throat awkwardly. He knew what had happened. Kaitlan had walked into the interview expecting to control the narrative, but Karoline had flipped the entire playbook on his head. And now, the fallout was inevitable. Karoline stood up and smoothed out her blazer, casually glancing at the cameras being powered down. She could already picture the headlines, the viral clips, the social media firestorm that was about to explode, and she was ready for it. Karoline Lavit. By the way, you might want to tell your fact-checkers to work overtime tonight. Kaitlan clenched her jaw. She wasn't going to give Karoline the satisfaction of a response. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed off toward the control room, where the producers were already engaged in frantic damage control. Karoline, meanwhile, took her time leaving the set. The cameras may have stopped rolling, but she knew the real show was just about to begin. The internet erupts. By the time Karoline left the studio and slid into the black SUV waiting outside, her phone was already buzzing nonstop. Her team had warned her that this interview would be explosive, but even they hadn't anticipated just how explosive. She unlocked her phone and immediately saw the notifications piling in. Twitter, X, was on fire. Fire Karoline Lavit just took Kaitlan Collins apart on national television. Fire watching Karoline shred CNN's narrative in real time was beautiful. Fire, how does Kaitlan still have a job after this? Fire. The clips were already circulating. Her takedowns on media bias, gun control, gender ideology. Even major conservative figures were weighing in. Tucker Carlson. Karoline Lavit just did what every conservative dreams of doing. She went into enemy territory and won. This was brutal. Ben Shapiro, absolutely demolished. CNN had no idea what hit them. Even liberal commentators couldn't ignore the fallout. The Young Turks Cenk Uygur. This is why mainstream media needs to step up their game. Kaitlan Collins just got wrecked, and now conservatives will milk this for weeks. Karoline smirked. They were right. CNN's emergency meeting. Meanwhile, inside CNN headquarters, the mood was grim. The top executives had gathered for an emergency meeting, reviewing the disastrous interview in real time. The energy in the room was tense. Everyone knew they had just handed conservatives a massive propaganda win. One producer shifted uncomfortably. Producer, the clip of her flipping the far-right question is already at 2 million views. It's getting worse by the minute. The network president rubbed his temples. Network president, we need to control this now. Get fact-checkers on it. We need a headline that neutralizes this before it spirals. A junior editor hesitated before speaking. Junior editor, sir, she didn't actually say anything factually incorrect. Spinning this might backfire. The room fell silent. They all knew the truth. Karoline hadn't just won the debate. She had exposed the entire media playbook. Any attempt to label her as a conspiracy theorist or extremist would only fuel her momentum. Kaitlan stormed into the room, her frustration boiling over. Kaitlan Collins, I need to go back on air tonight. We need damage control. The network president shook his head. Network president, no more live interviews for a while. Kaitlan's face darkened. Kaitlan Collins, so what? We just let her win. Silence. Because, whether they liked it or not, she had won. Karoline's victory lap. As Karoline's SUV pulled up to her hotel, she finally answered the call from her team. Campaign manager, that was legendary. You broke CNN. Karoline chuckled, stepping out of the car and into the cool night air. Karoline Lavit, yeah, I know. Her manager hesitated. Campaign manager, you're trending worldwide. Fox wants you on Hannity tomorrow. Megyn Kelly's team is reaching out. Even Joe Rogan's producer called. Karoline smiled. Karoline Lavit, perfect. She walked into the hotel lobby, phone still buzzing, her team rattling off media requests. But Karoline wasn't surprised. She had gone into enemy territory, stood her ground, and humiliated one of the left's favorite media darlings in front of millions. The establishment had underestimated her. And now they were paying the price. As she reached her hotel room, she checked her phone one last time before turning in for the night. One tweet caught her eye. Elon Musk. Wow, that was savage. Karoline Lavit, well done. Karoline smirked, tossing her phone onto the nightstand. Tomorrow, the media would scramble to spin the story. But it wouldn't matter. The people had already seen the truth, and Karoline Lavit had won.